Peace, peace, peace. All right, people. Again. Today we're gonna address marriage. It's a long-awaited question. I've been asked many a times to address this particular question. So today is going to be that day. Now, while addressing marriage, we'll also have to address Malikat, al-Aman, commonly translated as those your right hands possess, and that is because it's mentioned in the verse or verses that we're going to need to address, that we're going to reference when addressing this particular question. With that being said, I think the verses we're going to need to reference are about four or five verses in 3 different chapters. Those are the only verses required to address this particular question of marriage. There are no other verses from the entirety of the Quran required to address this particular question. Now, so with that said, we're going to start with chapter 4:24, which is really the only verse that addresses this particular question of marriage. So that verse starts off by telling us that among the prohibited women for the men are women who are married, except women referred to as Malikat al-Aman. So the verses before were all addressing women who are prohibited to men. Now, in that list, he addresses also married women being prohibited, except for these particular women referred to as Malikat al-Aman. The reason why there is an exception with them, we're going to address with the verses after, but we're going to address what is the requirement for marriage according to this particular verse first. Now, according to this particular verse, provided the woman who is sought is not among the list of prohibited women, the only thing that is required of a man is to approach that woman with his wealth and agree on a term. Now, once the marriage is consummated, the woman is entitled to what is referred to as ajurahunna, translated as reward, reward or fee or compensation, if you will. Now, the reason that's highlighted is because the Quran also addresses an engagement which the marriage has not been consummated, and what the woman is due in such a circumstance. It's I believe it's in chapter 2, 220 onwards. You'll find it somewhere there, or I'll even post it up, or I'll even put it up on this video. Yes, and in such a circumstance, then the compensation or the full compensation is not required, and in fact, even the woman is even encouraged to return even half of the compensation if the marriage has not been consummated. So that is why the differentiation is made. Now, going back to 4:24, once a fee has been agreed upon and transferred, once the marriage has been consummated, then that is the only requirement for a marriage according to that particular verse. According to that particular verse, or actually according to the entirety of the Quran, there is no other requirement other than that particular obligation, which is to agree on a fee once the marriage is consummated, or a fee that is due once the marriage is consummated. So traditionally, people are used to the requirement of witnesses, and also the requirement of perhaps the asking the father, the woman's father, for their daughter's hand in marriage. Those ideas are nowhere to be found in the Quran. Yeah, they're nowhere to be found in the Quran. So the verse goes on to tell us, going back to the verse goes on to tell us that there is no blame upon the couple if they mutually agree upon anything beyond the obligation. So beyond the obligation of that fee, whatever they mutually agree upon, whether it's changing the fee, lowering it, or even increasing it, there is no blame upon them, provided the obligation is understood. So that's all the verse goes on to say. So there is no other requirement for marriage according to the Quran. Now, so that's the moral standard that God will hold us to account for on Judgment Day. Like I said, the legal standards and the traditional requirements, etc., those are different. Those have nothing to do with this particular standard over here. Now, 425. Now, before I move on to 425, because that's very specific to Malikat Imanukum, what else is required in marriage or divorce according to the Quran? So we've mentioned what is required to engage in a marriage. Now, the other thing the Quran talks about is what is required for a divorce to take place. And that is that, for instance, a woman would have to wait 3 months before the divorce is finalized and she can move on to another relationship. The other requirement is obviously that a woman cannot commit adultery, so she has to be faithful to her husband. What else? And there is also obligations that are separated for the father and the mother in the Quran, and that's clearly stipulated, what is required from the father and what is required from the mother, and perhaps we'll discuss that in another video. But the point is, and the reason I'm mentioning this is this is really all marriage is. If a couple is faithful to each other, if they agree on a compensation in case of a divorce, and they observe a certain period before finalizing that divorce, for many reasons, among which is to ensure that there is no pregnancy, then there is nothing else really that is missing from this particular idea in order to understand it as marriage. The only other things that are not mentioned, if you think about it, are really traditional and perhaps legal, and those would be different topics to the topic that the Quran discusses. So that's that. There is no real difference between quote-unquote marriage and quote-unquote relationship, other than the financial commitment, which is clearly stipulated in the Quran. And then 425 goes on to basically tell us why there was an exception given with Malikat Aymanukum. Remember in the verse before, it told us that married women were forbidden to us except the Malikat Aymanukum. Now in 425 and in 2433 and 6010 and 6012, the verses that we're going to discuss basically tell us who the Malikat Aymanukum are, why they're referred to as Malikat Aymanukum, and why you can marry them even though at that particular moment they are legally married or officially married. So 425, actually perhaps before we start with 425, maybe we need to identify who these Malikat Aymanukum women are, and maybe we need to translate Malikat Aymanukum properly. So Malikat Aymanukum, first and foremost, the word hand is not in either Malikat nor Aymanukum. So the word hand is not there. It's not in the Arabic. It's not in the Arabic. So Malikat, possession, fine. Aymanukum has one of two potential translations in the Quran. And one is right and the other is oath. I repeat, one is right, the other is oath. So at most, if you wanted to veer away from oath, you could only translate it as those your right possess, or your rights possess, or possessed by your right, or possessed by your right. Take a pick. But the word hand is not there. Secondly, Malikat Aymanukum has never been used to refer to as a captive of any kind in the entirety of the Arabic language. It's never been used that way. In fact, the Quran is the first time they've ever come across the term, and perhaps they've used the term to refer to a captive of some kind after the revelation of the Quran, but that is not the meaning that they got from the Quran, nor is it some sort of an obvious meaning or some meaning that was understood before the Quran. So such an idea does not exist. Now, why are they possessed by your oath, or why are they those who your oath possesses, whichever? And you will find out why that is if you go to chapter 60 verse 10, and you'll find in that verse that it talks about women, believing women who escaped their mushrikeen husbands, their associating husbands, and they joined the believing men. So they migrated away from the mushrikeens, the associators, the deniers. So they joined the believers, and the believers were instructed to test them to ensure that, that they are actually believers and they haven't been sent as some sort of spies. And then it goes on to say that if they are recognized to be believers, then they are not to be returned to the deniers. The deniers have no right to be engaged with them, and they cannot be engaged with them. And it goes on to say that what they do have a right for is whatever they spent on these women. If you want to marry these women, then you are to return that expense to them. So you are to return that expense to them. I need you guys to remember this, so that who the Malikat Aymanukum women are becomes clear to you. So there is an amount. So if you want to marry these women, remember these women are married. They are married to these associating men. So if you want to marry these women, then you are to return whatever those men spent on them. Remember in 424, we were told that you are not allowed to marry, obviously, married women, except Malikat al-Aman. Here you see the exact same scenario, which is these women are married, and yet you're allowed to marry them on the condition that you return the whatever those men have spent on them. So there you can already see the connection, but we'll move on. And then it goes on to say, well, and if you are married to denying women, then you are to ask for what you've spent, and they are to ask for what they've spent, and you are to part ways. So the same scenario applies here. And then we go on to a verse after the verse after. We go to verse 12, and then we will see in verse 12 that they pledge allegiance to the prophet, and they make certain promises, i.e. that they will not associate with God, they will not lie, they will not steal, etc. Therefore, there is oaths that she is taking, that they are taking, sorry. So since they're making such oaths, they are pledging allegiance to the prophet, then that is the relationship between them and the believers. The relationship between them and the believers is that there is an oath between them for the time being, because it has not been established that they are one of them yet. So the only thing there is between them for the time being is that there is an oath between them. So those who possess your oath. Now, remember in 424, oh yes, so we're told, yeah, so remember in 6010, they were told to test these women. The believers are told to test these women. Now, obviously, with a test, you either pass or you fail. So we shall see in 2433 what results they've gotten. So in 2433, it tells us that if they seek the Malikat al-Aman, if they seek their writing, if they seek the writ, then write it for them if you know in them any good. So there's a writing that they want something in writing, which they're getting from the believers, and they get that writing from the believers if the believers are convinced that they are good. Very simple. So it's a recognition. They're given a recognition that they are safe to deal with, as opposed to not, in a nutshell. And then it goes on to say to give from the wealth that God has given you, give it to them. So from the wealth that God has given you, give it to them, give some to them. Which again goes on to show that this has nothing to do with captives of any kind, because they're being aided financially, as you can see. And then it goes on to say, and do not transgress against them if they seek to be inaccessible. So don't think just because you're financially aiding them that you have some sort of right over them if they don't want to be accessible to you. And then it goes on to say that and if you do, then God is most forgiving, etc. to them. And then 425 will actually, the last verse, 425 will actually tell us why or how God has forgiven them, the Malikat al-Aman woman that is, in such a scenario. How God has forgiven them, or how he was merciful to them. So 425, tells us that if you want to marry these Malikat al-Aman women, then you are to seek the permission of her people. Now remember, the verses before that we've read reminded us that if you wanted to, chapter 60 verse 10 reminded us that if you wanted to marry these women, then you had to return whatever their husbands, their ex-husbands to be, whatever they have spent, you are to return that to them. So here you go, same scenario. You are to seek, although the translation says seek the permission, it is merely inform them. And then it goes on to say, once you have done that, and then it goes on to say that obviously you are to give them their compensation or reward or fee once the marriage has been consummated. And then it goes, which is the same thing as the guarded women, or women that are known, protected women that are known, basically. Women that are known as opposed to women who are being tested. That's the only difference between these two groups of women. So yes, they are also due a compensation, but then it goes on to say that if they commit adultery, and by the way, obviously, these verses also remind us that the women that you engage with cannot be women who are ladies of the night, or women known to commit adultery, or women who keep secret lovers, etc., etc. Pretty straightforward. So 425 tells us that if these women, if they commit adultery, so the Malikat al-Aman women, you married them and yet they commit adultery. If they were to commit adultery, their punishment is going to be half of that which the protected women get, or the known women get. So the Malikat al-Aman women, those who possess your oath, they get half the punishment of those women, the other women, half the punishment. Now the reason they get half the punishment is because in 24:33, God tells us that if they were to be in a relationship that they didn't want to be in because of the financial needs that they have, in a nutshell, then God would be merciful to them. Well, here you go. They committed adultery. The punishment they get is half that of the other women. So yeah, that's it really. That is it. That is marriage in a nutshell in the Quran. There is nothing else about marriage in the Quran. Yes, there are those who also link the verse about debt. I believe it's in the last verse in chapter 2. They say, where there is debt, there is, a requirement for 2 witnesses, etc., etc. But that's to do with debt. I'm talking about marriage. It's very simple. That's to do with debt. This is about marriage. So yeah. So that's it. That is the standards. That is the requirements for marriage in the Quran. There is no other requirement for marriage in the Quran. If you believe I gave any opinion of mine, please strike it off. You don't need to pay any attention to any opinion of mine. All you need to do is look up chapter 4, 24, 425, 24:33, 60 verse 10, and 60 verse 12. If you believe there are any other verses that you can provide that deals with marriage or deals with Malikat al-Aman,